We'd spent 3 weeks sailing from the north coast of Africa to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. My sons were just small boys, and yet they were old enough to feel the excitement as we approached the holy city. As our small caravan came over that last hill, Rufus let out a shout. "Look, Father, that temple!" he shouted. The earthly palace of God gleaming as she towered over the city. Though my family had lived in Cyrene for generations, Jerusalem was for us, as it is for every Jew, our heart's home. That night we joined our cousins in Bethany for the Passover Seder, the Seder that marked the beginning of the festival, and we were sharing a meal and recalling God's salvation of our people. We ended that meal, as we did every year, praying for the coming of the Messiah. The next morning, Rufus, Alexander, and I left early to spend the day in Jerusalem, visiting the temple and then the festival taking place near the markets. As we approached the city, we saw what appeared to be a parade coming our way. But soon we could see this was no parade. There were Roman soldiers driving 3 criminals towards the rock quarry where criminals were crucified. Each of these criminals was carrying a heavy beam across his shoulders. One clearly had been badly beaten. His body was blooded, and he looked as though he could barely walk. I took Rufus and Alexander by the hand and pulled them away from the road. I didn't want them to see this terrible thing. Just then, the tragic figure of that sorely wounded man stumbled and fell at my feet. I saw that his brow was wrapped in a crude crown of thorns, and suddenly I realized who this man was. This was Jesus of Nazareth, whom some had claimed was the Messiah. He had been critical of the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem. I couldn't believe it, but they had actually sentenced him to death. Everything happened so quickly, I was lost in my thoughts, and then I heard one of the soldiers say, "You there! You! Carry his cross! And you, Jesus, get to your feet!" There was just nothing I could do. I told the boys, "Stay close." I picked up the beam, and it was far heavier than I had imagined. I put it over my shoulder, and then I reached out a hand to Jesus to help him up. He was clearly in pain, but there was a steel in his face, a strength and a determination. He looked at me directly into my eyes as if to thank me, and then he set his face towards Calvary. It was only a 5-minute walk to the place they called the Skull, Calvary, where the Romans crucified their victims. When we reached Calvary, I dropped the beam in front of the executioners, and I stepped back searching for my boys. Then we all stood and watched as they assembled the cross. They stripped Jesus naked and laid him on top of the beams. They stretched his arms to the sides, and then they drove spikes into his wrists as he shouted in pain. Then they nailed his ankles into the side of the cross, one on the right and one on the left. Finally, they hoisted his cross up and in position, and as he did, he let out another shout of pain. Because I'd never been so close to a crucifixion, I had not realized what a horrible, horrible thing this was. Rufus, he began to cry, and Alexander became nauseous. There were 2 thieves being crucified with Jesus, and the soldiers hoisted each of them up into the air, and the Romans shouted to the crowd, "Take a look at your king now! This is a lesson from Rome. Don't forget it!" The soldiers were laughing, and they began to throw dice for his clothing. Some in the crowd wept, and others hurled insults at him. The religious leaders, well, they just stood there with their arms crossed, a strange expression of satisfaction upon their faces. This is when Jesus took a deep breath, and someone in the crowd said, "Shh, he's about to say something." This is what he said: "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." I would never forget these words. Words from a dying man. Words from a man being tortured and crucified. Words praying that God would forgive his tormentors. What kind of man would do such a thing? His words would haunt me the rest of my life, and ultimately his words, well, those words would become the reason I became one of his followers.